when I was thinking about what I would say to light the chalice, I wanted it to connect to eco-theology. I wanted it to connect to religious naturalism, which is a type of eco-theology. And so I thought of, and to Japan. And so I thought of something very connected to nature that is very Japanese, and that is Shinrin-yoku, which is the forest bathing. I don't know if any of you have ever done that, but there, and I may be mispronouncing it, but I was interested in it. So I got this Healing Trees book, which is all about a pocket guide to forest bathing, Shinrin-yoku. And so I'll read from here something short at the beginning to light the chalice, and then there's a longer poem at the end, which I'll read to extinguish the chalice. But this poem encapsulates the idea of humanity connected to nature very simply. It's Lao Tzu. And Lao Tzu writes, "See the world as yourself. Have faith in the way things are. Love the world as yourself. Then you can care for all things." With that, I'll light this chalice. And feel free to light your own if you have one.
Beautiful.
I've learned in this age of Zoom not to blow the chalice out over the computer, because then you get wax on the computer. So with that, I'll start. And do I have the capability of sharing my screen? I do.
You do.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So at some point I will. So what the beginning of what I'm going to talk about, some of you may know or may not know. So I call this talk Nature's Music. Albert Schweitzer talked about nature's music, the famous naturalist. I call it Nature's Music and Eco-Theology of Spirit. So I lived in Japan many years ago. I lived in Japan in the late 80s, 1980s. And I distinctly remember the sound of the Shinkansen, of Japan's bullet train at the time, as it exited a tunnel. And I don't know if any of you lived in Japan in the 80s, but when the bullet train exited a tunnel, there was, it was memorable because of its volume. There was a burst of noise that was so loud it could be heard 400 meters away, especially in crowded residential settings, which is much of Japan. It was very troublesome, this noise. So living in Japan as you do now, some of you probably wouldn't know what I'm referring to, because a team of engineers led by Eiji Nakatsu fixed this problem. And Nakatsu-san just happened to be a bird watcher. And the new design of the Shinkansen train was influenced by a number of things. It was influenced by the serrations and curvatures of owl feathers. It was influenced by the hydrodynamic body of the Adelia penguin. And it was influenced, and I will share my screen for this, by the one of a kind shape of the beak or the bill of the kingfisher. You can see that. That's the shape of the Shinkansen as they redesigned it in the 80s. And the thing about the kingfisher, going back to my thing, the kingfisher, the shape of his beak allows it to dive down and pierce the water as it dives by its prey, causing barely a ripple in the water. So by designing the nose of the Shinkansen, it could pierce through the tunnel, essentially causing barely a ripple with the air and not create the noise. So the newly designed Shinkansen, it was faster, it used less electricity, and it was much quieter, and most notably when exiting tunnels. And it was designed, the design was influenced by owls, penguins, and the kingfisher. And the author, Janine Benyus, actually, it's pronounced, coined a term for this type of engineering and design inspired by nature. It's called biomimicry. And today, biomimicry innovations are used all over the place. It's in computing, in energy production, in health and medicine, the military, sports, business management, manufacturing, civil planning, countless other applications. But biomimetic design is not just about function, but nature also produces some of the most incredible artwork, beauty, which enriches human lives if we are mindful enough to notice it. With almost 4 billion years of research and development, it makes sense that the natural world is a fount of great ideas and incredible beauty. So we depend on nature. We depend on nature in many ways for our existence. Unfortunately, though, it's not just dependence, but it's often theft as well. Much of humanity, unfortunately, especially in the Western world, attempts to control nature with concern only for our own benefit. It therefore behooves us to keep in mind one way nature and humanity are very similar. We both have a tendency to resist being controlled. For instance, weeds grow resistant to herbicides. Viruses, we know, grow resistant to vaccines. Coyotes in the area where I live, they invade suburbia because of overdevelopment. Rats in New York, for instance, they develop resistance to poison. Some animals resist control by going extinct. With an environment as well, when we're talking about ecotheology, with tsunamis, melting glaciers, heat waves, and all of these things resulting from man-made global warming, this is how nature also resists control. So if humans want to continue to live and thrive, we must coexist in harmony with, rather than taking advantage of nature. And this is all darn good justification for the seventh Unitarian Universalist principle, which is respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part. Unitarian Universalism understands that, as the theologian and Nobel laureate Albert Schweitzer, who I mentioned earlier, wrote, he wrote, "By ethical conduct toward all creatures, we enter into a spiritual relationship with the universe." And ethical conduct can be achieved, I believe, by using our ability of self-awareness and rationalization to understand how much we need nature, and by using our human tendency to elevate that which we consider meaningful in order to love all of nature. In the book entitled Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion, Robert Cialdini talks about the rule of reciprocation. This is human beings' natural inclination to reciprocate when given a gift. As with many human needs, this too has evolved because sharing with each other in society, including gifts and necessities, as well as our special abilities, it serves to reset the harmony of our species. When someone gives us something, we have been socialized to want to show appreciation, to feel bad if we don't give back. I remember when I did a year of high school in Japan, and my host mother, I found out, was often giving gifts to the school when I would do something that was not necessarily in line with cultural mores, through no fault of my own, which I didn't understand. But anyways, this gift giving, so reciprocation facilitates living and thriving together in relative peace. We've evolved to do it so that we can live together in peace. So why do we have this reciprocation need, feel this need for reciprocation? Why does much of society then take, often with abandon, the abundant gifts given by the natural world and not feel that same need to give back all the time? Indeed, many people, many humans feel it's actually our right to use our planet for our own benefit with little, if any, concern for its health and well-being. Changing that mindset can be done and is done in many cultures with a reset of the heart and the spirit, and that's where the eco-theology comes in. The author, it changes, resets our spirit to be in sync with nature. The author and professor Ursula Goodenough, who actually, I heard her speak in May because she received an honorary doctorate this year from Meadville-Lombard, the Unitarian Universalist seminary that I just graduated from. And she received an honorary doctorate, so it was very exciting. And she's one of the most renowned advocates of, she calls religious naturalism, which is a form of eco-theology. So she writes in her book, The Sacred Depths of Nature, that religious naturalism is about suggesting ways that a scientific understanding of nature can, quote, call forth appealing and abiding religious responses. If, she continues, religious emotions can be elicited by natural reality, then the story of nature has the potential to serve as the cosmos for the global ethos that we need to articulate. So undertaking that project can only be done if, she says, quote, we all experience a solemn gratitude that we exist at all, that we all share a reverence for how life works, and that we all acknowledge a deep and complex imperative that life continues, is what Professor Goodenough writes. So essentially, eco-theology says that we must recognize all of nature, all of the natural world indeed, as divine. In other words, not in the image of any God or not created by any God, but as divinity itself, with a genuine connection of spirit between humans and the natural world, of which we are an equal part. This mutualistic symbiosis, too, is understood as is divine, as that which must be honored. We understand more clearly that not only does the symbiotic consonance sustain life, but the way we act much of the time in the Western world, this parasitic dissonance, absolutely will destroy life. So when we enter into this spiritual relationship with nature, we understand this eco-theology, when we feel this deep abiding gratitude, when we recognize it is indeed a gift we are given, we can no longer take it for granted. And the reciprocity instinct then kicks in, and subsequently the need to return the gift by caring for our world and all life upon it. And I'm certain we can do this more comprehensively because humans already have spiritual connections with nature. How many people have a pet that they would do anything for? Spiritual connection there. How many people, their plants, baby their plants with kid gloves and talk to their plants and sing to their plants? Even certain material objects like cars. If there is some deeper spiritual connection, we care for them like our own children. And many cultures elevate animals to the status of sacred. Local fauna is honored for the protection they provide, their intelligence, their instinct, their support of society in so many ways. There are religions worldwide. And as I'm talking about this, many of you may be thinking of Shinto and the kami that exist in nature through Shinto is very much in line with religious naturalism and many other indigenous cultural traditions. I know in the States, I'm not so familiar elsewhere in the world, but I know many indigenous cultural traditions that respect and honor nature significantly more than Western culture. So we are doing this. It is just when that connection, that spiritual connection either doesn't exist at all or exists, but it's out of sight, out of mind, as it is in much of Western culture, unfortunately. It is then that we become too distracted to mindfully take in, for instance, the fleeting beauty of the sakura, of the cherry blossom, which, blossoms 1 month a year. We become too busy to see it, outside of Japan, that is. I know in Japan, everyone sees it. Or we become too distracted and too not mindful enough, too stingy to pay, for instance, $1 more to buy the cage-free eggs instead of the farmed eggs. In these ways, we destroy ourselves. Human disregard for nature, as well as our unsustainable, unhealthy, insatiable addictions, they destroy the earth. As another example, beef farming here in the United States. Beef farming takes up nearly half of the agricultural land in the United States, but it accounts for only 12% of our protein intake, and it accounts for only 3% of our caloric intake. We could be exploring many more sustainable sources of protein, save for our addiction to beef and our addiction to profit. So, sorry. We're careful, for instance, to change the oil in the cherished automobile I was mentioning, or we always make sure that our beloved dog gets plenty of exercise and rest and hydration. Yet in the Western world, mostly, we overuse the resources of our planet as if Earth never needs a tune-up. or it can't be overheated, because until recently, the larger implications of that simply didn't touch our individual daily lives in a significant enough way, but they are now. And the irony is that in this age of the Anthropocene, they call this age the Anthropocene, literally the Anthropocene, the age of humanity. It's literally what it means. And that's where it is assumed, and it's probably true, that human influence has now come to dominate nature. That is the age. And in this age of the Anthropocene, where it is assumed that human influence has come to dominate nature, we actually need nature more than ever to survive. When humans understand that it's not just some lives that are of value, but the entirety of the natural world, then we can recalibrate our thinking and our actions with love. And love means recognizing another individual and figuratively, at least, attempting to see through their eyes to the extent possible. Now, you might say, well, inanimate objects occurring in nature, they don't have eyes, with the possible exception of potatoes. And non-human animals, for instance, they don't have the human equivalent of the ability for abstract reasoning or self-analysis. However, all life, animate, inanimate, all life, all nature, I should say, some of it isn't living. Indeed, all of nature has needs and gives back to us. Additionally, we're also recognizing more and more that non-human animals also feel hunger and thirst, pain, emotions like love, fear, and distress, and often feel them deeply. And to be sure, the beauty of nature is not always obvious, and sometimes it's not pretty at all, this beauty of nature. The natural world evolves as much through violence and through death and subjugation and annihilation as it does through evolution, through growth, through rebirth, through regeneration, through peace. The cycle of life, similar to our own rhythms and undulations of our human sociological and anthropological cycles, this cycle is never stagnant, and it's certainly never easy. And it's often what we would consider not beauty, although I would argue that it is beautiful. But returning to nature as a teacher, we can learn from her. What we can learn from her is invaluable and limitless. We learn how to overcome challenges and what it is to love unconditionally, for instance. Nature models that even in the conflict and disorder of life that I mentioned, even in the ugliest of life, she models that there is still immense beauty. We understand better the very real struggle that is survival itself. And most vitally, we understand how to live and thrive together in peace by watching nature. Whether it's, for instance, the murmuration of swallows, they fly together in the air, or the colonies of aspens or mega shoals of herring in the sea living in community. Whether it's the fragile impermanence of the single drop of dew represented in the haiku of the Japanese poet Issa, whether it's the importance of rest, so cherished by the sea elephant. Whether it's any of these things, as the poet Reginald Holmes wrote, the earth has music for those who listen. Yet despite all of this, nature is yet another woefully undervalued teacher. At least in the States, we undervalue our teachers. I know they don't as much in Japan, but here we do. So my talk today, though, it's not an admonishment to change the way humankind functions completely. In the States, for instance, it's not practical for many people to become completely vegan, for instance, often through no fault of their own. I mean, there are health considerations, there are financial considerations, amongst others, that result from our colonialism and our white supremacy culture that make it next to impossible right now to just switch to vegan for many people who are marginalized. It's also not reasonable to expect a quick and easy or complete dismantling, for that matter, and remaking of industry to become eco-responsible. I mean, we're working toward that, but it's not reasonable to expect that it's going to turn on a dime and everyone's going to become eco-responsible. We should work towards those things. They're necessary. And ideal as they may be, what this talk is today is a request. It's just a request to develop a greater reverence for the natural world as we are able. The natural world, which is heretofore and currently stunted to the detriment of us all. It is a plea to do this by nurturing a spiritual connection, eco-theology, nurturing a spiritual connection to the interdependent web of all existence, bolstered by love and respect, that we may proceed forward in steps toward an ever righter relationship with our world. I'll go back to Albert Schweitzer, who wrote, "The deeper we look into nature, the more we recognize that it is full of life, and the more profoundly we know that all life is a secret, and that we are united with all life that is in nature. Humans can no longer live for themselves alone. We realize that all life is valuable, and that we are united to all this life. And from this knowledge comes our spiritual relationship to the universe." So let us listen to nature's music and to understand how we must respect her, our life partner and our greatest teacher.